few years ago, I met a guy from Vancouver named Michael. Now, on paper, he was doing all the right things. He took a safe job to support his family, he was a good husband, and he was a great father, but behind closed doors, he was struggling a lot. He was binge eating multiple times every week, overeating every night before bed, and every day at work he would make excuses to leave the office and duck out to get cookies from the supermarket or go through a drive-through or just spend some time snacking in his car. He was spending every day at a job that he hated, sleeping badly, leaning on food to cope, and every day getting further and further away from the person that he wanted to be. He wanted to be an active, energetic, positive influence in his household, but this downward spiral of binge eating, garden variety overeating, and poor sleep was just... it was leaving him with nothing left. And this story is not unique. Michael could be one of 50 people that I've spoken to over the last 5 years who came to me struggling with binge eating. None of us choose consistent overeating or binge eating because we think it's healthy. But whether we feel driven to food in that way because of years spent doing really rigid and restrictive diets, or whether we feel like food is just the last thing we have left to be able to give ourselves, it can wind up being a really difficult downward spiral. So 3 things are going to happen right now. A, I'm going to share with you a few facts about binge eating and overeating. And bear in mind, when I say overeating, I mean consistent overeating. I mean the kind of overeating that happens pretty much daily. It's human to overeat sometimes. You know, you go to a party, you're with friends, it's a family holiday. Overeating sometimes, it's fine. That's not a problem. When I say consistent overeating, I mean overeating every day in a way that has a negative effect on your health, both physical and mental. Second thing, B, I'm going to help you avoid the biggest mistake that people make when they notice that something like this is going on and try to make changes. And C, I'm going to ask you which of the things I've mentioned you'd like me to expand on in the next video. So some important things to understand about binge eating and consistent overeating. It's a physical stressor. It might provide us a window of emotional or psychological relief, but eating in this way is a physical stressor on the body. And it's most likely part of the reason why you might be feeling as bad as you could be feeling. But I know that's obvious. You already know this, but we want to keep this front and center in our mind so that we're aware of this downward spiral. We experience pain, we experience discomfort, we experience fatigue, we do something to try and relieve ourselves of that actually puts us in a worse situation. We feel worse, we self-medicate again, we spiral down. Now, the mistake most of us make when we find ourselves in a position like this is to go on some kind of strict diet or strict regime to try and stop the process. And that makes sense on paper. We try to take that control back, but being really restrictive with our diets and micromanaging all the food that we eat can often result in increased cravings, and it just makes the situation so much worse in most cases. The action we need to take here is less about rigid dieting and more about the following few things. Firstly, accepting that climbing out of a downward spiral is going to be very uncomfortable. This is what keeps most people stuck. The fact that the first few steps of an upward spiral often feels so much worse than how it feels to stay in the downward spiral. So things get temporarily more difficult before they start to feel better. I've lost count of how many people I've coached through that part of the process. If you take nothing else from this video, remember this. The first few steps of an upward spiral often feel worse than how it feels to stay in the downward spiral. Really important to keep that in mind as you start taking action. That yeah, this is hard, but that's also kind of a good sign. It means I'm working against the current of the things that were keeping me down. Another thing we need to be looking at is practicing new ways of dealing with stress and difficult feelings, rather than leaning on food in this way. Of course, that's going to feel hard, but what's going to happen is that rather than experience these big peaks and dips in how you feel, your baseline for how you feel most of the time will come up. So practicing new ways of dealing with stress, we want to look at things that don't numb you quite as much as food does, or maybe alcohol or those kind of things, but at the same time gives you a little bit of relief. doesn't leave you just sitting there with it totally undistracted. This is how we manage our discomfort rather than avoid it. And that's what leads to higher levels of resilience and in turn, happier human. And on a practical level, when it comes to food, it's really important to practice eating in a way that makes no foods feel like a big deal. This means not relying on rigid guidelines or micromanaging. I know it feels much easier to just set really hard lines in the sand and go, okay, I'm calorie counting and I'm staying under this range, or I'm eating these foods and not those foods, and that's just how it's going to be. Strategies like that feel really clear and solid on the front end, but often fall apart with time. Developing skills around having more options does feel like it gets you off to a slower start, but it will take you the distance. It will go further. So part C of what I mentioned earlier, this is where I want to know from you which part of this whole process you'd like me to expand on for you. Which part would you like actionable steps for? Because I could make hours of content on any one of the things that I've mentioned in today's video. I want to know what would help you most. So for today, just remember, binge eating and overeating, it creates this window of emotional and psychological relief while placing more stress on the body. That comes back to bite us in terms of our health and energy levels, and in turn our mood, how we feel, eventually brings us back to medicating with food in one way or another. But the pathway out of that isn't as simple as saying, right, now I eat perfectly healthy and that's just what's gonna happen from here. I've been there, I've tried that, I can promise you, that's not the way. So let me know in the comments what you'd like to hear more about in the next video. My name's Marcus, and I'll see you next time.